first off, thanks so much to everybody for coming. We've got a really excellent lineup of speakers who are going to talk to us about opportunities for building a sense of national ownership over the NECP in this revision process by meaningful public participation, but also centering policies around just transition and tackling energy poverty. So as we talked about in our last session, the NECP revision process is this once in a decade chance really to start to enhance transparency about Ireland's planned climate measures, but also the supporting policies because of just how prescriptive the template is. There's very much an expectation that was set higher ambition in terms of our climate and energy targets. It's a really important data sharing exercise between the member states. Really important with the NECP is this idea that we're going to have to set out where the investment is coming from to support each of the policies and measures. And as we the real focus of today, I suppose, is how we can build up this sense of public ownership through the public participation process to increase a sense of public buy-in and I suppose foster this sense of ownership over the decarbonisation process. And I suppose as a lawyer, I suppose the last kind of really important part to the NECP process is this idea of it being having potential as an accountability mechanism. So we're joined by three excellent speakers. First off, we're going to have Alison Hawke, who's a senior lecturer in the Technical University of the Shannon and head of Access to Justice, the Access to Justice Observatory at the EGNI, and really guru when it comes to all things Aarhus, about the Aarhus Convention. After that, we'll have Clodagh Daly, who's the manager of the Centre for Environmental Justice at the Community Law and Mediation Centre. And she's going to be talking to us about why increasing ambition is essential for a just transition, how workers' rights can be strengthened, and the imperative of tackling energy poverty and air quality together. And then finally, we're going to have Izzy Petrie, who is the Research and Policy Officer at St Vincent de Paul, who is the lead author of St Vincent de Paul's recent report on energy poverty entitled Warm, Safe and Connected. Really, really excellent resource and one I definitely recommend people check out. And she's going to speak to us, I suppose, about this issue of energy poverty in Ireland and how the NECP could be an opportunity to engage more with energy poverty. So with that, I will hand over to our first speaker, Alison. And thanks again to everyone for your participation.
Thanks, Orla, for that introduction, which I'm going to try my best to live up to. I don't think I've ever been described as a guru before, but I kind of like the sound of that. I might make that my official title in TUS from now on. I'm going to talk to you today about a resource that myself and Ciara put together on public participation in the NECPs, and it's we put it together in cooperation with the EEB, so it will reflect a lot of the guidance that they're offering as well. So, you know, we've kind of there's a lot of kind of joined up thinking gone into this as well, even though it's quite a short resource. And I'm just going to pull it up on screen here before I go into the full presentation on it. Oh no, that's Orla's one, which I was looking at earlier. So Orla has this resource on the role of NECPs as a driver of net zero ambition, which I'd also really recommend as well, and was going to mention after mine. But let me see if I can find the one that I put together here. Sorry about this. Too many tabs open in my sharing tray, and let's see. Yeah, no, I'm struggling to find that one anyway, but I'll start the presentation and hopefully it'll appear in the rotation. So the topic of the briefing paper that we've put together that's available on the EGNI website is public participation in the NECPs, and the focus of it is on the public participation requirements of the governance regulation, but also how they interact with the existing framework that the context that they sit in relation to public participation. Because when you look at the provisions in the EU governance regulation for public participation in the national energy and climate plans, they're quite thin, and you know the clause is quite brief and it doesn't give a lot of detail. It doesn't sound very mandatory, and it's very kind of vague as to how it interacts with the with other pieces of EU law mentioned, like the SEA directive, the Strategic Environmental Assessment Directive, which would require public participation in the preparation of a plan. And it's given rise to a lot of confusion, I think, and it meant that a lot of countries in the last round of NECPs didn't do their public participation very well. And then it also meant that because the clause was vague, the Commission didn't enforce it very strictly. So they commented on some of the reports on the NECPs that were submitted about the lack of public participation or the quality of public participation, or the extent to which public participation was taken into account when it was done. But they didn't really do anything further than that, just said it and it went into the report, and that was it. And that's on file in a filing cabinet. So I'm not sure to what extent it's been effectively enforced. And I suppose that's one of the problems, is the wording of the governance regulation kind of creating this sense of weakness. But it shouldn't be the case, because the legal framework is extremely strong for public participation in a plan like this. And like there could be no doubt but that public participation is required in the national energy and climate plans, and with good reason as well, because I mean, these are plans that set the course for the next 10 years of our climate and energy action, which, as many of the speakers here today will know better than me, and will be able to speak to more articulately than me, really impact on the most vulnerable in society in very fundamental ways, and are kind of really about rewriting our social contract in a way as well, to ensure fair distribution of the losses and the harms and the responsibilities for climate change, which at the moment are not being distributed fairly either in Ireland or globally as well. So the legal framework within which public participation in the National Energy and Climate Plan sits is massive. You know, there's massive support in the legal framework internationally at EU level and domestically for that participation. And you could go back as far as you like, if you like, in terms of the history of public participation to find support for that, to the Stockholm Declaration. I won't go through all of the different international frameworks that are there in a short presentation like this. But, you know, I've made the argument in an article that I've just published that public participation in environmental decision-making is actually an international, a rule of international law at this point, that it's attained the status of a rule of international customary law, and that therefore countries should abide by it, even if there wasn't a specific legal provision in their domestic legislation for it. But also there are specific pieces of legislation in the Irish legal framework that do support it, which emanate from the Aarhus and Espoo conventions, which are conventions primarily about environmental rights and the right to be involved in environmental decision making. Espoo is focused on environmental impact assessment, whereas Aarhus is broader than that, and has that kind of three-part structure of procedural rights for access to information, public participation, and access to justice. And in particular, the Article 7 of the Aarhus Convention requires participation in plans and programs. So it's mandatory that there be public participation in plans and programs, along with information as to the environmental effects of those plans and programs, a bit like EIA and permitting decisions. And the Espoo Convention has an SEA protocol, so Strategic Environmental Assessment Protocol, and that has very similar framework for mandating public participation in plans and programs and environmental assessment of plans and programs, and the provision to the public of information about the environmental consequences of the decisions. And obviously, you know, they apply to plans and programs that relate to the environment. And, you know, you couldn't really circle out the NECP out of that category very easily without a lot of mental gymnastics. Then we have the Public Participation Directive, which applies to environmental impact assessment and licensing, and the SEA Directive, which applies at that second higher level. So the Article 7 of the Aarhus Convention level, the plan and programme level, and that creates cross-cutting obligations across all areas to facilitate public participation and environmental assessment of all plans and programmes that would have a significant impact on the environment. So there, it slightly narrows the category of plans and programmes, but I still think that it would be very hard to argue an NECP doesn't have a significant impact on the environment. And then you have the sector-specific provisions, particularly the governance regulation, which we're looking at here in detail. There's other ones like the new Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, which has got public participation elements to it as well. But you know, the idea of participating in plans is kind of universal across all areas of EU environmental law. And so the public participation under the Aarhus Convention, just by way of refresher, comes in kind of three flavours, if you like. The Article 6, which is the activity or project level, so where you're permitting a use of land or a change of use. And that's the most common form of environmental decision-making that people participate in through their submissions and observations in the planning system, or submissions and observations on pollution control licensing or on forestry licensing or the like. Article 7 then is where we're at today, the plans and programs right in the middle there. And public participation is mandatory for plans and programs under the Aarhus Convention. It's phrased in less mandatory terms for policies, which I always found odd, but it's the way it's characterized in the implementation guide to the Aarhus Convention is that it's mandatory as to effort for policies. They must try, but they don't necessarily have to produce the results, whereas it's mandatory as to results for plans and programs. And similarly, then legislation actually requires public participation as well under the Aarhus Convention, not so you'd notice lately, but that's a whole other, that's a rant for another day, I think. So public participation in the NECPs then, the main kind of significant and immediately relevant pieces of legal framework are the governance regulation, the SEA directive, and the protocol to the ESPO convention as well. So what that amounts to is summarized in the briefing paper that Kira has circulated, and it's basically means that you have to prepare a draft plan and a draft EIA, and you have to facilitate public participation then in or contribution to that draft plan and draft environmental impact assessment in early course, so early in the process when all options are on the table. So the draft plan itself should have several options in it, and obviously a favourite option that's been put forward as the draft decision, and that should be put forward with reasons why it's been chosen, with an analytical basis for the decisions, and then with the environmental assessment information necessary for the public to be able to assess the draft decision as well, and also environmental assessment information for the other options as well in brief, to show why they're less environmentally sound, if you like. And it should also contain process info, so process information. So the idea of information about the public participation process should be contained in the initial draft document that's issued. And also in transboundary contexts, there's a requirement to carry out transboundary consultation under both the Aarhus Convention and the SEA protocol to the EIA directive, or to SEA protocol to the ESPO Convention rather. And it's also, required in the governance regulation as well. So there's reference to the transboundary or regional cooperation. And it's really important that that's done, I suppose, in Ireland, because we share a jurisdiction, or share a geographical region with another jurisdiction, which is Northern Ireland. And so it's, obviously everything we do as regards our large scale climate and energy plans is going to impact on Northern Ireland and vice versa, but also then further afield as well, like in the UK and other countries. So the government should identify the countries that are affected, contact them and ask them if they want to participate, and then conduct public consultations in those countries. And that should be part of the information taken into account in the final decision. So the public should be able to submit comments. The public concern should be identified early on and engaged with. NGOs are a special part of the public concern, so they have to especially be facilitated in public participation. And then there's provision in the governance regulation for multi-stakeholder dialogues. So you can consult on NECPs, and there are best practice examples from other countries on this, which are listed in the EEB document on public participation. And there are plenty of good examples of what a multi-stakeholder dialogue should look like. But basically, it's like get together different sectors of society in a representative capacity and consult with them. And the governance regulation doesn't say that has to be part of the NECP public participation, but it recommends that the NECPs are discussed in multi-stakeholder dialogues. So they make it a good idea, basically. And there should be notification provisions. So the public should be notified in early course when the public participation process is going to happen. They should be provided with environmental information on request, and also the assessment report should be provided as a matter of course. They shouldn't have to ask for that, and it should be provided in a timely fashion in the process as well. So timing is really important with Aarhus public participation. So the public have to get a say early on when there's still possibility to change the decision, and they also have to be given the information in a timely fashion as well. And then when the public participation happens, that has to be taken into account. Now, the governance regulation doesn't specifically say that, but if you piece together the jigsaw puzzle of legislation and international law that I've outlined in the previous slides, it's pretty apparent that you have to do that as part of any Article 7 type public participation process. And then the decision should be communicated to the public. Again, that's not required by the governance regulation, but it is a requirement of Aarhu's public participation. And so in summary, I suppose what it would be desirable would be simplified processes, because that would help everyone. It helps the public trying to engage if the process is simple and straightforward. And it helps the decision maker as well if the process isn't really bureaucratic and very drawn out. Early participation is better. Participation increases buy-in, so people are more satisfied with decisions where they've had an opportunity for real participation. And you can use technology to reach people in public participation, but I think that has to be done with an eye to the fact of the digital divide, particularly in Ireland, and with great care, so that it doesn't actually exclude people and kind of replicate the injustices that public participation is supposed to prevent. And I suppose that, you know, the problem is, I suppose, the deadline of the 30th of June for submission of our National Energy and Climate Plan to the EU Commission in draft form. And we really should be getting our skates on in terms of, if we want to start a public participation process with sufficient time for the public to engage in such a complex thing. Because I would think that, you know, at a minimum, you'd want 3 months for the public to be able to digest an NECP document, a draft document, and environmental impact assessment report, and put in meaningful submissions to that, instead of this business like the last time where they gave a month, which is like not enough time even for experts to go through a document like that and digest it. So that's me. I'm over time. Apologies. And I will stop there.
Thanks so much, Alison. That was really, really helpful. Clodagh, if you want to, do you need to share your screen?
Yes, please, Orla.
I think you should be able to share it now, Clodagh.
Just to say, Ciara's put the document in the chat that I was trying to find, so thanks, Ciara.
Thanks, everyone. So just to say thanks so much to EJ and I for facilitating these meetings and this kind of organising around the NECP. It's really, really helpful. And Orla, your report was brilliant as well. It's such a useful document, and I'm looking forward to reading the public participation report as well, Alison. So I'm just going to give a really quick overview to community law mediation and our work in the Centre for Environmental Justice for those who aren't familiar with our work. So CLM was set up in 1975 as part of the Campaign for Civil Legal Aid, and today we assist more than 4,000 people nationwide through free legal advice clinics, education, mediation services. And we also do quite a bit of work on policy and law reform and for the safeguarding of rights already enshrined in law. And so our services focus on areas which disproportionately affect those experiencing poverty, social exclusion or inequality. So across issues like housing, social welfare, employment, equality, and then access to services like healthcare and education. So in 2021, in February of that year, so just over 2 years ago, we expanded our work into the area of environmental justice by setting up Ireland's first Centre for Environmental Justice. And what brought CLM into the space was that through the course of our work, my colleagues were seeing that people's homes were being impacted by climate change due to issues like repeat flooding of housing, or their health is being impacted due to polluted air. And we were also alert to the potential unfairness of climate action measures on marginalised groups. So we can see that, for example, through the failure to extend retrofit measures to members of the traveller community or to those living in the private rental sector. So that's just a brief overview of what we do. So today I'm just going to speak very briefly on how we might begin to look at delivering an NECP that addresses emissions reductions and inequality together. This isn't intended as a comprehensive overview of every recommendation we're going to have. This is something we're going to be working on over the next couple of months. And if others are interested in collaborating with us on that work, we really welcome that. And we'd be happy to share any resources we come across that might be useful or of interest to this group as well. So to start, just going to speak about why why there is a need to not only fulfill Ireland's existing obligations on climate change, but to actually ratchet up their scale in the context of a just transition. So from CLM's perspective, that's what we will be calling for. And essentially there are three main kind of provisions that we'd like to see met. So first is adherence to Ireland's current climate carbon budget that runs between 2021 to 2025, as we all know. Second is EU targets and ensuring coherence with those. And then finally, the Paris Agreement. So emission reductions that are commensurate with Ireland's fair share contribution to remaining within 1.5 degrees are critical to avoiding, as we know, the worst impacts of the climate crisis, and by extension, protecting human rights to the full extent possible. So a transition cannot be just if it is too slow, if it will exceed current carbon budget restraints, or if it will not deliver a fair share contribution to the Paris Agreement. And we know as well that the longer climate action that meets the scale of those reductions is delayed, the more difficult those transformative delays become. And as the window to remain within 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees narrows, the policy response might become abrupt, forceful and disorderly. So it's critical that efforts are rapidly scaled up to actually enable effective planning and consultation with most affected communities and workers as well. So some of our kind of headline asks around this would be that Ireland's NECP needs to be consistent with EU legislation at a minimum. So that would be a 55% reduction by 2030 relative to 1990. We would also be calling for the Irish government to go further than that and to contribute to the EU's fair share of meeting the Paris Agreement target, which would be, as Orla pointed out in her document, a reduction of between 66 to 77% by 2030 relative to 1990. We will be calling for accountancy tricks to be avoided. So that's to just ask for consistent and harmonized emission targets and related baselines, looking to 1990 instead of, for example, 2018, and to include all sectors of the economy like aviation and shipping as well. We'll also be calling for the long-term climate action strategy and the national adaptation framework to be published as a matter of urgency so that we can see how they align with the NECP. There was a really interesting and very valid discussion in the last session about the feasibility of calling for higher climate ambition in the context of continual growth in emissions in Ireland. And I think that it's a really valid point. And so we can understand as well why other organisations might not call for the same. Just to explain that from CLM's perspective, we would be seeking to push for higher ambition because the parameters of political possibility are always up for debate. And just to paraphrase a quote by Naomi Klein, we don't need to make the difficult the enemy of the possible. So while this is a really difficult situation that we're in, it isn't impossible to imagine that really transformative and radical reductions in emissions could be achieved when matched with equally ambitious social change. And we saw during COVID what is politically possible in terms of the state's financial levers when an issue is treated as a genuine emergency. So the NECP process presents us with kind of a fresh opportunity to make the possible real. The second point that I'm going to speak to only very briefly is the strengthening and protection of workers' rights. So obviously accelerated climate action will impact workers, particularly across emissions intensive industries and sectors. This is actually an issue that's been presenting to our free legal advice clinics. So the kind of headline arguments that we would be calling for here is to accelerate the establishment of a Just Transition Commission. This has been published or promised within the government's Climate Action Plan and Annex of Actions, but it's long overdue at this stage. So we'll be calling for that to be accelerated and kind of keeping it on the agenda. We'll be calling for the government to identify the social challenges that they expect from the implementation of the EU's Fit for 55 package, and then to detail what measures and resources will be necessary to manage them within this NECP. We'll also be calling for the government to go beyond investment in decent jobs and retraining of workers that may need to transition away from emissions intensive sectors, but also to be providing really comprehensive social protection policies for those who may not be in a position to or may not wish to retrain. And then finally, to develop a just transition strategy to address identified challenges across all sectors of the economy. And then finally, looking to a joint approach to energy poverty and air quality. So we know that air quality contributes to about 1,300 deaths in Ireland per year. That's according to data provided by the Environmental Protection Agency. And they also highlight that air pollution is the single largest environmental health risk in Europe. Air pollution impacts certain groups more than others because of where they live, where they can afford to live, and the level and quality of healthcare they have access to, and as well because of existing respiratory problems. And we also know that up to 40% of households are experiencing energy poverty in Ireland, according to data from the ESRI. FO, Friends of the Earth, published an excellent report recently on energy poverty in Ireland. This highlighted the fact that Ireland had a 19.7 excess winter death rate between 1980 and 2013. So this is the highest rate of all Northern European countries, and more than twice that of either Finland or Iceland. So what we know is that thousands of people die in Ireland prematurely each year as a result of energy poverty and air quality. These issues are really closely connected. Many households who are in or at risk of energy poverty may rely on traditional sources of fuel, like turf or wood, to heat their homes without being aware of the significant health impacts of doing so, and without access to affordable and readily available alternatives. And so the negative effects of emissions can be that are caused by the burning of solid fuels are compounded with serious impacts on health and well-being as well. And it goes without saying, obviously, that addressing energy poverty and air quality would also do a lot in terms of delivering on Ireland's emission reduction targets. Many of the primary contributors to air quality contribute directly to climate change. Combustion in the electricity industry, transport, waste and livestock sectors, as well as the use of solid fuels for heating, create detrimental health and environmental impacts while heating our atmosphere. And similarly, in relation to energy poverty, almost half of Ireland's housing stock is energy inefficient, with poorly insulated homes locked into fossil fuel dependence. So housing is responsible for almost 20% of Ireland's carbon emissions. So we would be calling for the government, and have been calling for the government, to kind of address these two issues in tandem, but to date they've been kind of seen as separate issues. And so this was seen last year, for example, when the government introduced its solid fuel regulations before publishing its new energy poverty action plan. And the former energy poverty strategy had lapsed in 2019, 3 years previously. So when the solid fuel regulations were introduced, there was no comprehensive framework in place to actually address energy poverty. And unfortunately, the Energy Poverty Action Plan that was published in December doesn't really do much to reduce people's energy bills in the short, medium and long term, in terms of ensuring that everyone has access to clean and adequate energy. On air quality, the government is currently developing its National Clean Air Strategy, and it's also contributing to the development of the EU's Ambient Air Quality Directive. So the World Health Organization actually updated its air quality guidelines in September of 2021. And when they did that, they noted that there are no safe levels of air pollution. So those stricter WHO standards need to be reflected in EU and national air quality policy and law to ensure that our right to breathe clean air is protected, and that our laws and policies are informed by best available science. But funnily, in conversations with the department, we've learned that the department is actually really reluctant to take on WHO standards even by 2030 because of energy poverty. And that approach really doesn't serve people who are experiencing energy poverty. Both really need to be addressed together and holistically. And so the NECP provides an opportunity to kind of deliver that more holistic approach and to hold the government accountable to meeting its EU air quality standards, because a committee within the European Commission recently published a report on the EU Ambient Air Quality Directive, and they've recommended that the EU adopt World Health Organization air quality standards by 2030. So what we don't want is a situation where Ireland is stalling, and then when that directive is adopted and transposed into law in a couple of years' time, it will be a little bit too late for Ireland, or they might say it's a little bit too late for Ireland to adopt WHO standards by 2030 or to adhere to that. So our headline recommendations on energy poverty and air quality will be to call for legally binding energy poverty reduction targets and to enshrine WHO air quality standards within the NECP. Obviously, on air quality, that is not required by the governance regulation, but we would like to see the NECP be coherent with other EU law, which is coming down the track. We would like to see these targets underpinned by clear monitoring and accountability mechanisms that are measurable, actionable, and time-bound. And then we'd like to see the electrification and expansion of Ireland's entire public transport fleet, including the expansion of local link services to ensure access to reliable and cheap public transport across Ireland. So I'm going to leave it there, and thanks. And yeah, as I said, we'd be really open to working and collaborating with other organisations on this over the next couple of months. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Clodagh. That was really, really helpful to kind of get a sense of some tangible policies that would be useful to see in the NECP revision. So with that, I'll hand over to Izzy. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, Orla. I'll just share my screen. So hopefully you can all no. There we go. Hopefully that's coming up for you guys. So yeah, thank you, Orla, for arranging this conversation and inviting me to speak a little bit about SVP's perspective, particularly on energy poverty and how that might relate and kind of transpire into like recommendations for the NECP. So I'm going to focus on energy poverty from SVP's perspective, both within the context of the energy prices that we're currently seeing, but also the climate crisis and the transformations and changes that we need to see and we are starting to see as a result of that. So in terms of energy poverty, and to start off kind of looking at the national picture, we know that as a result of the price crisis at the moment, at least 29% of households are now in energy poverty, based on the measure of spending more than a tenth of their income on their energy needs. But that is now likely to be higher. And I think a few months ago was estimated to be at 40%. And so that's a measure of people spending a tenth of their income, but we know many people will now be spending a lot more than that. And it's important to sort of complement that expenditure indicator with people's experience of energy poverty and energy hardship. And so we can also look at the deprivation figures that we have, which also show a very stark picture. So the latest national deprivation figures that we have were collected in early 2022, which was kind of before further price rises that we've now seen. And one of those deprivation figures is households or people who were unable to afford to keep their home warm enough. And we saw that figure more than double, to over 375,000 people, or over 7% of the population. And within that deprivation indicator, we can see the concentration of hardship that is going on, which very much reflects what SVP members would see when they're assisting people, which is extremely high rates of energy poverty amongst one-parent families, amongst people who are out of work, who are unemployed or unable to work due to ill health or disability. We also see very high levels of being unable to keep the home adequately warm among renters, and also high rates amongst children, which is also really concerning from a health point of view. Previous research that SVP has published called Growing Up in the Cold from 2019 really drilled down into the health impacts on children of growing up in energy poverty. But we can also see in that particular indicator that for people living rurally, there was a huge jump in people who couldn't keep their home warm, which increased by, I think, more than 4 times, or from 1.4% to 5.7%. So a very huge jump there for people living rurally. So as I said, that's kind of the the national data, and it very much reflects what SVP members are seeing and have been seeing in the last year or two as prices have been rising. So last year in 2022, we received as an organisation over 230,000 requests for assistance from members of the public. And that reached at the busiest time of year up to 1,200 requests a day in December. And particularly in terms of energy, we saw requests for assistance with energy costs and people's energy needs up 40%, and also an increase of 43% of people requesting assistance with multiple issues, which is most often a combination of help with food and help with energy, which I think speaks to the juggling and the impossible choices people are making on those day-to-day essentials. So I've just pulled out a few of the I suppose, themes or challenges that people are facing and members see people facing, but this isn't an exhaustive list at all. It's just to kind of touch on some of those issues. I don't know if you can hear the traffic outside, so sorry, hopefully that's not too loud. So we're very much seeing a particular crisis for prepaid customers who obviously don't see a lag between energy prices and the money they have or the money they have to top up. So prepaid customers have really seen that difference with how much their top up will get them, whether that's 2 or 3 days, where it used to get them through the week. Members will also see really clearly the emotional and mental health impact of energy poverty and energy prices, the impact both on prepaid customers, but also people receiving bills and that feeling of a rising tide of bills that can't be met, knowing the next bill is already coming. There's obviously a clear interaction between people's energy needs and people's health. We know that people with ill health or with a disability might need higher energy use, leading to much higher energy costs, and kind of also in the other direction, the health impacts of people living in energy poverty, things like the impacts of living in a damp home. And particularly, we would see a lot of concern amongst parents for children who they know are growing up in a cold or a damp home. And I suppose we're very much seeing people having to cut back and juggle on those minimum essential needs day to day. So beyond heating, worrying about things like hot water for the shower. So in terms of our response, we've obviously, and I'm reflecting here slightly on the longer term, but longer term responses we've seen to energy poverty through things like increased commitments to retrofitting in recent years, but also kind of specifically as a response to the energy price crisis. So just to touch on some of the measures that we've welcomed, we've seen investment in better energy warm homes and the free energy upgrades, and also upgrades of local authority homes. There's now a new energy poverty action plan from the end of last year, outlining the range of actions being taken to help households who are at risk from rising energy prices. And also from, I think, autumn last year, we've seen important new consumer protections that recognise a range of risks that customers and different customers within the energy market face. And we also saw a series of once-off payments delivered to households in winter of last year, which temporarily eased the pressure on households who, when those payments came through, had already dealing with a year or more of inflation. But clearly, both based on the hardship that our members are really seeing at the moment, and also what we know, looking at those national figures from earlier in 2022, what we know we're going to be seeing in the next set of national figures, we need to continue responding and returning to our response and seeing where can we increase our ambition and where can we increase our targeting and see the groups that we're still missing. So I've just pulled out a quote from Orla there, which calls for kind of this iteration of the NECP to kind of focus on those detailed, credible and ambitious measures to meet our targets. So just to pull out a few of, I suppose, first reactions of things that we would like to see in the NECP revision. And these would echo some of the things that Clodagh was also talking about. The introduction of energy poverty targets, both overall targets as well as sub-targets for particular groups that we know are most at risk, and further monitoring of the outcomes of those different groups as we go along, to kind of feed into the refining of the policy process there. So within the current iteration of the NECP, there's commitment, or it states the government's commitment to reduce consistent poverty to 2%. And we welcome that being included in there, as it ties the experience of energy poverty and the causes of energy poverty into the wider experiences of poverty, particularly issues around income, and sets up those links with income adequacy and inadequacy. Although I would note that, you know, we're going in the wrong direction on that target. So the target for consistent poverty is 2%, but this year in the most recent figures, we saw consistent poverty increasing from 4% to 5.3%. But we also, I suppose, want to keep that inclusion of that consistent poverty target, but also complement it with a specific energy poverty target and those sub-targets as well. And secondly, touched on it there, just to make sure that that link is still recognised between income, between energy poverty and income adequacy and inadequacy, and the role of the government in tackling income inadequacy, both through social protection, so core social protection rates, as well as specific measures like the fuel allowance, and also for workers through policies like the minimum wage and the living wage policies. And we would very much see their income adequacy as tied to the minimum essential standard of living research that sets kind of a baseline level of income that people in Ireland should not live below, that provides the income needed to live in dignity and meet you know, the essential cost of living in Ireland today. And just to note there on the fuel allowance, we would both like to see the fuel allowance increasing in value rather than decreasing in value, but also being extended to everybody that we know needs to see that specific support for their energy costs, and in particular people on social protection payments like the working family payment, and also seeing extended to all job seekers. So thirdly, we're still really concerned about the people not being reached by retrofitting, which I think Clodagh also mentioned there. So we really kind of recognise the importance and the ambition of the free energy upgrade scheme that we have, and the grant that is on offer there. But kind of notwithstanding the waiting times that people are currently experiencing to actually go from the application process to receiving the upgrade there, we also know that there are many groups who won't benefit from that scheme because they're not homeowners. So we would have particular concerns about low income private rented tenants. And I suppose this danger of ever increasing inequality in people's experience of housing and tenants' experience of housing due to the split incentive that remains there and really needs a policy response. And we would be particularly calling for free upgrades, so an equivalent scheme to be extended to private tenants who are in receipt of HAP based on having protections in place, so long-term lease and security of tenure for them. And we would also like to see much greater ambition for social tenants in local authority housing, and rather than only setting out the target number of upgrades, to also set out kind of the proportion of social homes we want to see reach BERs as we go to a target of local authority and social housing all meeting a high BER. So finally, and this is my last point, I think there's a lot of development that can be done around consumer protection and how connected people are with sources of support, and also kind of with having their experiences represented and their experiences as consumers kind of represented in kind of policy and regulation processes. And I think this kind of speaks to a broader point that we've already touched on today about kind of participation in these processes, but also kind of specific angle that I think is important, both in the price crisis and in longer term kind of climate transitions, about knowing what people are experiencing day to day and knowing how kind of changes as we go are affecting people, and being able to kind of spot these problems as they occur, as well as also spot them coming down the line in advance. So just kind of 3 kind of sub points on this. We would like to see a consumer protection strategy published by the regulator, a multi-annual consumer protection strategy. We'd also like to see the gap filled for a consumer and energy consumer advocacy agency that kind of has that dual expertise in people's experience and the detail of people's experience and different people's experience, and also expertise in the energy market, and can kind of delve into and look deeply into what's going on now, and also kind of what's coming up and where changes that we know are already coming will intersect with people's experiences and potentially people different vulnerabilities, and where we know that people are at high risk of energy poverty and other kind of adverse impacts within the energy market. And just finally there, we would continue to call for community energy advice service that provides kind of one-on-one tailored support to people who are in energy poverty or struggling with energy, which would kind of provide holistic all-round support to people on their energy needs. So it might help them with the complexity of dealing with the energy market, with things like tariffs, navigating tariffs, but also kind of work with them to see if there are kind of quick installations and measures at home, and then through to that kind of longer term horizon of if there are kind of retrofitting grants that they could be supported to access and things like that. So that's me. I'll stop sharing and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Izzy. It's really, really helpful to get this kind of perspective from, on the ground, what issues are coming up and what we can and should expect to see in the NECP when it comes to tackling energy poverty.